Can we have a round of applause for Hannah Kallady? Thank you, Hannah.
Unfortunately, I have to say, my name is Hannah Kallady. I was just talking earlier about how my name is like said phonetically, but people always see, it seems to like, they get tripped up. They're like, oh, I need to make this fancier than it actually is, but that's okay. I also just want to quickly start by acknowledging that we're meeting tonight on the land of the Wurundjeri people, acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging, and that we're actually part of a bigger story that's much older than all of us. And that's my segue into storytelling. See how I did that? So yeah, as was mentioned, I work for a digital agency called Ntegrity. We work on digital strategy, implementation, marketing, consulting, all kinds of things for lots of different types of clients. And we work a lot with not-for-profits as well as government and commercial clients, a lot of startups in the mix too. So hopefully that will be relevant for a lot of you tonight. This is my very boring bio and probably a very giant picture of my head up there. But I guess the stuff that's not up there really is that I've loved storytelling and stories since I was very, very small. I remember some of the first books my dad read me that weren't picture books were Lord of the Rings and Sherlock Holmes and The Hobbit, which are very unusual choices for a child, but I loved them. And I also loved writing. I actually found a book that I wrote when I was maybe 10 the other day. It's this full-page watercolor illustrations. It's about brumbies and a horse that gets lost. It's terrible. It's honest to God awful. But luckily I've improved since then. But anyway, the point of that is I've really loved stories and storytelling for a long time. So it was natural that I got into communications and journalism. Unfortunately, the job market was not so great when I graduated. So there was a lot of internships, and I ended up at an online magazine called My French Life. Where I accidentally started doing this thing called digital marketing. I didn't know what it was called. I was just trying to grow a magazine, reach people online, and that's kind of what I ended up doing. And that's also where I met Rashendo, who's the founder of Ntegrity. We were both working at the York Butter Factory, and that's how I ended up with Ntegrity. And I think even though it felt like some of my education, my Master of Journalism and my comms degree were a little bit useless at the end of the day, I've actually come to realize that storytelling has never been more important, and it's actually incredibly relevant and important skill. And I'm going to share a little bit of why. As Georgina mentioned, it's that space in between what the words are that we're using and what should we be saying. It's that big question of what's the story we're actually telling? How do we talk about our brand in a way that's relevant? So the question is, why content? And the main reason is that marketing and communications and how we talk to people and reach people has just changed so much. I remember 5 years ago, we used to say that it's changed more in the last 5 years than it has the last 50. 10 years later, I don't know what that looks like, but it keeps changing. And the main reason is that it used to look a lot like this funnel behind me. So it was all about the brands with the most money and the biggest voice, and they were the ones who controlled what you see. Think kind of like a Mad Men era. So essentially you would just make decisions by kind of starting with a few options and narrowing down. You'd think about, what ads have I seen? What do I see in the shops? It was a very kind of simple process, and it was really about who's on the billboards and who's in the magazines and the newspapers. But as we know, that has changed a lot. So decision making is so different to how it was before in a few different ways. Just to name a few, I guess when we start making decisions, rather than narrowing down from the outset, we tend to widen up our considerations. So if you think about, I need a new fridge, you're not going to then just go down to the shop and pick the first one that you find. You're going to do research online. You might go to the shop and have a look at a few. Then you might go home and Google and find which one has the best price and who can deliver it for free. So many things that you're thinking about. And the power as well is really in your hands. So you're choosing what you want and what's most important to you. And that's very different to before, where brands decided what was most important and they would put that message out there. And so decision making looks a bit more like this loop behind me. And this is one from the consultancy McKinsey. If you're interested, definitely Google that. It's a great model for consumer decision making. And you'll see that it starts at that awareness, but then sometimes it has this really long evaluate phase where you're actually trying to figure out all of those options I mentioned before. You're trying to compare against competitors and not just brands, but which site should I order from? All of those sorts of things come into play. And then you get to purchase, but it doesn't stop there. And that's also something that's really unique about how consumers engage with brands these days, is that a lot depends on the experience that you actually have after you purchase. So if the product that you buy sucks, it doesn't work, you're not going to be happy with that purchase, and you're going to go online and tell everyone about it. And you're going to tell all your friends, don't buy that fridge because mine broke on day one, or don't order from this company because it didn't come like it was meant to and they were really unhelpful. But on the flip side as well, if you resolve problems really well, then that can actually turn out really, really well for you because people will tell others about how that experience was great. So as you can see, I'm getting at the fact that experience naturally influences whether people advocate for you. And even though we're talking about a highly digital space, word of mouth is still one of the most important drivers for marketing. So you've got to think about how can I get my customers to tell other people about their experiences with me. So as is kind of wrapped up in that loop, you can see that a lot of the power is in the user's hands. And so it's not just enough for you to say, what do I want to say to them, but you've got to think about what are they thinking, feeling, doing, what do they want from me, what do they hope to achieve, whether that's addressing a pain point they might have or kind of helping them to reach an aspiration. So it's all about tailoring that story to what the user is really thinking and how they're making decisions. So often what we'll do is we'll go through with clients and map out that process, and that's, you will have heard of customer journey mapping probably. It's a really great process to go through, and it's one way of arriving at the bigger story that you should be telling. Now I want to tell a couple of stories here just for a moment to illustrate the power of stories. And this first one is about the Queen and J.K. Rowling. So there's a really great organization in the US called Contently, founded by a guy called Shane Snow. If you're interested in content, very much worth looking up. He did this little test. He sent out a survey to, I think, a couple of thousand people in the UK and said, who would you trust more as your monarch or your leader, the Queen or J.K. Rowling? Queen's had a lot of experience. She was kind of born into the role, but overwhelmingly people said that they would actually trust J.K. Rowling. And his reason for thinking that was that stories actually forge connections. So, you know, we all grew up reading Harry Potter. We feel like we understand J.K. Rowling because we've been inside her imagination. We've felt connected to her stories. And from that point of view, we feel like we have this emotional connection with J.K. Rowling now. Actually, I'd be interested to see if you did this survey post The Crown being on Netflix, because that might have changed. We might feel like we're actually more connected to the Queen because we've seen this fictional version of her life on TV. So it's really important to think about the fact that stories and content build that connection. So think about how you're building that connection along that customer journey loop at every touch point. It's not enough just to throw away a touch point and say, oh, that'll be fine, we can just put that message out. It's an opportunity to build connection, so don't just let it pass by. This next one is about a scientist on a plane, and he was watching the movie $1 Million Baby, which if you watched it, you'll know is a bit of a tearjerker. And this guy, he's pretty tough, he's not much of a crier, but he watched this movie and he just found himself bawling on a plane. And he, being a scientist, was sort of like, I want to find out why this is actually the case. So he set up an experiment. And the idea was that he wanted to see what would happen if two groups of people viewed slightly different stories. So one group of people watched this story about a dad and his son who had a really bad, I think, terminal illness potentially. And the story was very emotional. There was a narrative arc. It took you on the journey. The other version of the story was more factual. It sort of laid out what was happening and allowed you to sort of build your own connection to the story. So they watched this and they saw that there was massive differences in the kinds of chemicals that were released in the two groups of people's brains and the way their brains were lighting up. But they also, after that, had another sneaky bit to the experiment where all of the participants ran into somebody in the street who needed help. And the group who had watched the emotionally driven story were far more likely to help that random stranger than the other group were. And that's because there's something in stories that actually make us care. They can build connection like we saw before in a way that information can't. It's why charities use stories to help forge that connection between you and somebody across the other side of the globe. So if you have something, a mission behind your brand that you want people to care about, think about how can I tell that story in a way that connects with that person, that gets them emotionally invested in it, and then builds that connection. Final story. This is a very, very excellent TED Talk. And I'm going to say her name wrong, but it's Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I hope I said that right. And she's a writer from Nigeria, and she talks about the danger of a single story. So she grew up in Nigeria, which was a British colony, reading British books about kids with blue eyes and blonde hair who talked about the weather and drank ginger beer. And she just thought that's what stories were. So she started writing, and she would write stories about white kids with blue eyes and blonde hair who talked about the weather, because she didn't realize that anyone's story can end up in a book. And she talks about how as she grows up, she begins to realize that actually my stories could be stories too. And she has to challenge this idea that things are only just one thing, or that narratives can only just be one thing. So stories actually have a way to change how we see things, how we see others, and how we see ourselves. And it's really important to think about, how is the story I'm telling changing the way people see my brand, see the people that I'm representing, see the people I work with. So think about what are all the facets of that story that you need to unpack for someone. So just a couple of stories to illustrate the power of stories. Another way to understand this, so we talked about the history of humankind. This is actually wired into our brains, which is really fascinating. This is my very non-scientific drawing of a brain. But essentially, what happens when we hear information is that a couple of parts of our brain light up. So our frontal cortex, which is all about judgment, decision making, the parts of our brains that are all about decoding language and understanding things light up. So right now, they're the parts of your brain that are working while I'm telling you this information. But if I was to start telling you a story, or you were to read a story about someone running through a pine forest, and you could smell, it had just rained, and you could smell all the pine needles around you, other parts of your brain actually start to light up too. So the parts of your brain responsible for your sensory cortex and your motor cortex, so the parts that are actually light up when you're actually smelling something or when you're actually running, are lighting up as if you're doing those things, but you're not, you're just reading about them or hearing about them. And the deepest part of your brain, your limbic system, so you'll remember that from Inside Out, if you've seen that bit, they're all in the limbic system where long-term memory is stored. It's where memories that have close connection to emotions are stored. So we actually are engaging whole different parts of our brains that make us feel things, that make us experience sensations we didn't know we could. I always cry at Qantas ads and Telstra ads for this reason, because it's all about that like connection and the families coming home and the beautiful Australian landscapes. So they totally get me in the right places. So it's thinking about, yeah, sure, you might just be selling a product, but how do you enhance that and lift that up to become more than just a product, but a story or an experience that you want somebody to be part of? What do they feel when they're engaging with you? What frustrations do they have about, their accounting software? How much time do they lose every day trying to use that? Paint that picture of what life could be like if it wasn't the case, and get them to imagine themselves there. There's lots of different ways you can use these stories to tell. It might not be the right example for you, but it's just thinking about what's that bigger narrative that I'm putting people into. So here's a pyramid you might have seen before. It's called Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. And this is a bit of a model, whether you agree with this model or not, as a psychological or social tool. We use it to help us unpack audience drivers. So now that we understand how the brain works, now that we understand that stories are really powerful, the natural question is, well, what stories should I be telling? Because you don't want to just tell any, because that's not necessarily going to be relevant for your audience. So we use this as a little bit of a model to help us unpack drivers. So at the bottom of the pyramid are your really basic needs. So things like sleep, food, security is the next level up. So safety, feeling free from harm and persecution. Next level up from that is belonging, so being part of a community. They're all things that we need. And if we don't have those things, that's where the dark side of the pyramid that we've added in comes in, where they turn into fears. So if you don't think you're going to have enough food, obviously you're going to be afraid, am I going to be able to survive? Or if you don't have a community, you're afraid, where do I fit in? Or maybe something bad is going to happen to me because I don't have people to look out for me. Above that is where we move into things that are more likely to be desires or aspirations. So things like esteem, feeling good about yourself, and that really top bit of the pyramid is self-actualization, so achieving your best self. And when those desires aren't met, they just become frustrations. So when you don't get something you want, you get frustrated. And so we actually turn this into a grid. So if you draw 2 lines and you put these into 4 boxes, start brainstorming. What does my user want? What do they need? What are they frustrated by? And what are they afraid of? And it gives you a bit of a picture of what really matters to this person. And from there, what we tend to do is look for the themes that are starting to emerge. So you will see commonalities, and you'll be able to pull those out into sort of a model to help you start look at what are the elements or the pillars of that bigger story that I'm telling. So is it the fact that I want to help somebody build community because they are feeling alone or by themselves, which is a common thing for founders and entrepreneurs if we're speaking to a product that's speaking to them? For a lot of other people, they want to feel like they're making an impact or they're doing a good thing, and that's a common one for not-for-profits. And so you'll start to see things emerge that give you a little bit of a clue of what's that biggest story that I need to be telling. So this is a really great process to go through if you're unsure. Another way of looking at it is pains and gains is often a common way that we address that. So it'll give you a framework to start thinking about this kind of thing. So we talked about copywriting before. And sometimes it can just look like what words you're using, how to approach it, but it's about thinking about copywriting as storytelling. And that might sound a bit lame because you're like, I'm just selling a product, but it is really a story that you're communicating with somebody, whether you're telling a long story or a short story. And it's also very easy, especially in a new business, to just want to create lots of stuff. Like, oh, I could create 20 posts and they're just going to be about all of these random things. But that's actually not strategic and it's not helpful. So that's why it's really important to have a strategy behind all the content you create. It actually takes a lot of weight off your shoulders too. Because you can say, actually, I'm free to not focus on all this stuff over here that's not useful and hone where I actually know it's going to add the most value for my business. So that's a really helpful thing to think about. Oh, I think some of my slides are missing. I was going to give a couple of examples, but I'll just give them to you now without slides, of a couple of organisations we've worked with who have really interesting or challenging stories to tell. The first one is an organisation called Australians Together, and they have the very challenging task of getting non-Indigenous people to engage with our whole history, understand Indigenous culture, understand where we came from and where we're going. And they do that a lot through education. They're trying to work with schools and get things into the curriculum, work with workplaces and think about how we can do this better, engage with really scary topics like Australia Day, which are terrifying. And so we've been working with them for a few years, and their challenge was, how do we get people to engage with this topic that we all actually feel a bit guilty about, that's really scary and we don't know how to engage with? And so we've been through this process with them of looking at, what are the elements of that story that we want to tell? What's that journey that people are going on to learn more about this topic, and how do we get them to care? And so we started testing as well on Facebook. We put lots of posts out there just to see what would work. And what we learned was that when we got too complex or too complicated, it did not work out for us. It just confused everyone. And we actually arrived at the best mix for their content on Facebook, which was all about positive stories, because you really don't often see positive stories in that space about how we're actually achieving things or how Indigenous people are achieving great things. Some kind of shocking or emotional parts of our history that we might not know about, like the history of Rottnest Island, which I didn't know about. Google it after if you don't either. We found that there was a bit of a mix of just introducing people to the fact that there was something bigger going on, and that was what we used their social channels for. And then they draw people into another space where they can have a deeper conversation, and they do a lot of their learning and education through sharing other people's stories. So by getting Indigenous people to share about their experiences as members of the stolen generation, or just as people trying to figure out how to live life. And they've realized that that is the biggest and best way to build connection with an audience. So even though they're in one of the most complex and challenging spaces, they've actually managed to find a way to tell that story. So it doesn't matter if what you're selling is hard, might not be as tricky as that, but there's always a way to find that strategy that's actually going to cut through. Actually, I was in an awards ceremony a few weeks ago, a marketing one, and a girl got up and she was like marketing manager of a shopping precinct in a city that I won't name. And she said, I have the hardest job in the world. And I was there with Australians Together, and I was like, oh man, reconciliation, that's a bit of a trickier space. So it's a hard story, but you can tell it. The second example I wanted to speak to is a business based in Melbourne. You might have heard of them. They're called Your Grocer. They're fantastic, and Morgan, their founder, is awesome. If you ever have a chance to speak to him, definitely do. But he's got a really big vision, and his business is, so essentially they deliver food from 65 plus local shops around Melbourne. So you can get deliveries from the Queen Vic Market, from the Paran Market, from a bunch of other places to your kitchen bench. The idea is you can skip the supermarkets, but still do it in a way that's convenient. And he wants to create a fairer food system, which is a really big vision. It's about, making sure that the supermarkets don't control prices, that we can be a bit fairer to our farmers, that we can support small business. It's all of these kinds of things wrapped up. But it's tricky because there's lots of grocery delivery options out there, and people really mainly just care about saving time, about doing something that's easy for them, and if there's an added bonus of feeling good about it, that's awesome, but it's probably not the main reason that they might choose something. So we've been working with him over the last few months to shape that story and think about how do we take this big topic and this big mission and turn it into something that's actually really meaningful. So I think the process here might be helpful for some of you guys in that we started with really trying to capture his vision and his thinking and turn it into that baseline narrative. And that's what we did first. We didn't start by doing lots of posts or emails or trying to figure it out as we went. Now that we have that baseline piece in, we're then able to cut it up and say, what does this look like for a welcome journey on email? What does this look like on a landing page? What does this look like for a content strategy on social media? The important thing is you've got to start with a strategy, because otherwise you're just doing lots of stuff and it's not necessarily going to provide that holistic experience for your users and your customers. So that's been really exciting, and we're still in the midst of it. We're still figuring it out. So watch this space. But yeah, I'm really excited to be telling that story and to see what works there. And that's the other thing, is it's always it's a live process. You all know if you're founding a business, it's all about testing and learning, about iterating, about pivoting, and that's exactly what you need to do with your stories and your marketing as well. And I think I had one tiny little example to finish off, which was about the importance of words. So we talked about words and how they matter before, but there's a couple of instances where we've seen that words can actually make a world of difference. So just two really small examples. We've done some work with the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation. After some research that we did with them, we found that there was one big thing getting in the way of them talking to people who really needed to hear this stuff, and that was the use of the words gambling versus betting. We don't talk about gambling, we talk about betting. If you think about betting apps and things like that, they never used that word, and they really needed to change the lexicon to actually speak how their users and customers or people who needed help were speaking. And that goes back to what we were talking about before with the words that you choose and how they resonate with people. The other one was more recent. We've done some work with the Department of Jobs and Small Business in Canberra. They found out that people don't care about careers, especially older Australians. They just want a job. So when we were talking about how you could get a start on your new career, they were like, oh, that sounds like a lot of effort, and I've already been through 20 or 30 years of work. I just want a job. And so just changing that a little bit, A, it helps them to understand that you get them and that you're on the same page as them. But B, it resonates with them. They're more likely to stop and take notice. So think about what are those words that might be relevant in your context that people are using that you actually need to tap into. You need to speak their language, because otherwise it won't resonate. So I probably had a slide at the end that was summing this all up for you. But I guess the big takeaways are really just thinking about this as what's that overarching sort of story or strategy that I want to be telling my users, and making sure that it's really grounded in what matters to them, what they're thinking about, the stuff that keeps them up at night, stuff that makes their days hard and frustrating, or the dreams that they might have, or the things that they want to achieve. Start there, figure out what that story is, and then break it up and figure out how it sort of plays out across a range of channels. So that's all from me. Thank you.